Hello and welcome to this first segment on evaluating effective design in the English 102 class this quarter. As with all of our assignments, make sure to stay up to date with the readings as well as our lectures on this YouTube channel and the PowerPoints that accompany them. So this is going to be the evaluating design PowerPoint, how we break down how our eyes receive and process information. Analytical writing is a critical examination of the parts that make up the whole, and analytical writing is going to form the basis of what we'll be spending most of our time on this quarter. The parts we'll be looking at in Peter Menzel's Hungry Planet book include words and phrases as well as images, colors, patterns, and spatial arrangement. We're going to have to look at all of those elements in order to successfully analyze how a person intentionally makes choices to communicate a message within a visual text. Visual analysis focuses on identifying and understanding these features of a text and interpreting the meanings that they represent. We know that nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything has a purpose behind it. And so the images that Peter Menzel chooses to include in his book also have a purpose and a message that they're seeking to communicate. In addition to an analysis of what the visual image is communicating, an effective visual analysis typically also contains a copy of the image and a written description of the image. So as we move into our first essay, which is going to be based on the Hungry Planet book, you're going to be including a copy of the image in your works cited and including a written description of what the image looks like in the first paragraph or two of your essay, relying heavily on your descriptive language. Writing in the genre of analysis is research-based rather than personal-based, and the analytical presentation is focused and straightforward. This means that we want to avoid first-person language in our writing, so we don't want to use words like I, me, or my. We'll also want to avoid second-person language like you and your, as that tends to detract from the focus of our writing. So as we are going to focus that analysis on design and the different elements that come together to create an effective design. So why is design important? How images are composed has an impact on an audience. And why do we think this is the case? It's because we often unconsciously pick up on design elements and make snap judgments based on our idea of effective or poor design. Think of some ads you've seen perhaps in a local newspaper or on billboard signs around you. You can tell ads that are well created. Somebody spent money and time and thought to create them. Those are ones that are much more engaging than the ads that are poorly organized or have bad color choice or just are off in some way. We're not as impressed by them and we don't pay as much attention to them. This is due to poor design, certainly, but also due to poor use of rhetoric sometimes when we're not engaged by a text. And so Aristotle, a very brilliant man, said that there are 3 elements of rhetoric we need to pay attention to when we're trying to convince an audience of something or communicate a message. The first of those 3 appeals, which he called them, was ethos, so the perceived credibility of the speaker. This is at play in each visual to show the reader that a source can be trusted. We have to be able to see that the source is credible and worth our time. Pathos is Aristotle's emotional appeal, and it engages the reader with the emotion so that they can relate to the visual subject. And logos is the logical appeal. It engages the reader with the use of logical construct, clear cause and effect relationships, or other logical links between ideas. So the elements of visual analysis come together with the elements of rhetorical analysis, which are those ethos, pathos, and logos appeals, in order to help convince an audience that something is worth looking at and the message that it conveys is worth listening to. So as we move toward our Hungry Planet essay, we're going to look at some very specific elements of visual analysis and how we can apply those pieces of analysis to the Hungry Planet images. So the first piece we're going to be looking at is focal point. And the definition focal point is to what extent does the eye hone in on one spot that immediately captures and directs the viewer's attention? Or are there so many things on the page that they are very evenly positioned or sized to focus? When we look at the Hungry Planet images, we see that there's a distinct focal point where your eye wants to go first, That can be dictated by color, that can be dictated by the way the food's arranged or the way the people are arranged. Pay attention to that focal point as you look through the images. What captured your eye first, and why does your eye go there? Why does your eye think that that's the most important thing in the image? That's what we look for when we analyze focal points. We also want to look at color contrast for readability when we look at a text. To what extent is it possible to clearly see the page elements and clearly read the text? I don't know if some of you are old enough to remember MySpace as opposed to Facebook, but MySpace was a social media website that allowed you to design your own web page, and people made horrible design choices. Many colors fell into this poor category, with red on blue background or red on green background. Very difficult to read. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at an image, whether it's being effective in the visual spectrum or not, you want to look at that color contrast in terms of text and readability. There is text throughout the Hungry Planet book, and there are subtitles underneath all the images that Peter Menzel chooses to include in his book. And so he's got some color choices he makes there. The color contrast and visibility chart can be helpful as you analyze his choices in the book. We also want to look at the color aesthetic. You know, aesthetic is concerned with beauty or the appreciation of beauty. It's also defined as a set of principles underlying and guiding the work of a particular artist or artistic movement. So we're going to look at the aesthetic of the color. Does it look good? Does it appeal to our senses? Does it look beautiful, or does it look bad? So to what extent do the colors complement or contrast each other? Or do they conflict with other colors on the page in terms of tone, value, intensity, and hue? As you're analyzing your Hungry Planet images, most of the color in those images oftentimes comes from food. So you can look at how the food colors contrast with each other and how that contrast draws attention, perhaps to one type of food over another. Type, contrast, and aesthetic. In this category, we're looking for to what extent segments of text are differentiated, either through size, weight, structure, form, direction, and color, in an effort to emphasize important information and establish a hierarchy. We've been trained that the biggest thing is probably the most important thing, and so what is looking like it's most important in the image? What kind of text is cluing us into important messages that Peter Menzel wants to communicate? We're also looking for what extent are the type styles used for a particular design, and how the values of the audience dictate who it's directed to. So pay attention to type, contrast, and aesthetic. Proximity and grouping are important as we analyze images. We want to look to what extent are related items grouped together to strengthen visual cohesion and improve the organizational content of the page. So we need to look and see, are different foods grouped together? Are the people grouped in an interesting way? What kind of setting do they find themselves in these images? Proximity and grouping will be a helpful category as you start to tackle your visual analysis. Repetition. Sometimes things show up more than once when we're looking at visual analysis. And so to what extent is there repetition of elements on the page? Particularly, you'll see repetition in terms of the food showcased in the Hungry Planet images. So why are some foods more plentiful, perhaps? Why is there repetition of those foods? Does that reflect something about the culture of the people in the image? Does it reflect something about perhaps their economic status? If all they can afford is potatoes, then there's a lot of potatoes in the image. If they have more money, then there's more variety that we see. So how does repetition tell us something about the family and a little bit about the culture that family lives in? Alignment. As we do this aspect of visual analysis, we want to look at what extent the items on the page align or connect visually with other items. Alignment can teach us a lot about family dynamics in these pictures. If people are closely grouped together, if they're touching each other perhaps, it could communicate a more dynamic, closely connected family than if they're further apart or spaced in odd or awkward ways. So we want to look at alignment in the images as well, see how the pieces of the visual come together to create a message for us. We also want to pay attention to white spacing. Went a little too fast there. To what extent is white space used to separate items, direct attention, and contribute to the mood of the design? Sometimes the empty space is just as important as the filled space, so we want to give it our attention as well as we look at these images. We're almost done with the list, I promise, folks. So integration and cohesion of images, another aspect we want to look at in visual analysis. To what extent do the various parts of the design look integrated and/or compatible with each other? This sort of integration and cohesion can also teach us a lot about a family. Are they compatible? Are they very close to each other? Are they touching? Or are they more spaced out? We can look at their facial expressions as well and see if they're all compatible facial expressions. Do they all look happy? Are there some members of the family who look less thrilled to be a part of this project than others? There's a lot we could analyze and try and understand about these families and cultures based on this category of visual analysis. Another thing we want to focus on is the content and emphasis of important information. So to what extent does the design include the information a viewer would need to be persuaded or to make an informed decision? In this case, we're looking at the families Peter Menzel decided to highlight in his Hungry Planet book. We want to look and see how those families function within their culture, within their family dynamics, what their food looks like for the week, and how their lives look like for the week that Peter Menzel highlighted here. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the content and see how he emphasizes different things more than others within the images. All right, so that's the first section of this lecture. Tune in for the next video to get some practice and to see how some of this can apply to our Hungry Planet book. As always, if you have questions, reach out via Canvas or email, and I'm happy to answer those questions for you.